about to go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amy Waterman from the Friends of the Maine State Museum, and on behalf of both the museum and the Friends, I want to welcome you as we celebrate this wonderful book, this extraordinary book, Maine Quilts, 200 Years of Comfort and Community, and its author, Laurie LaBar. Before I introduce Laurie, I just want to cover a few small bits of business and tell you how things will work this evening. First, you'll see that we're using Zoom in its webinar mode, which means that you'll see the panelists' faces, but you won't see one another. However, we definitely want to hear from you. So we're going to encourage you to type your questions into the chat. And maybe you would all just, to check this, open your chat and notice that there's a pull down menu. We want you to write to all participants. Even though your questions will largely be directed to Laurie, we want to make sure not to miss anybody because we'll be gathering them up to post some of those questions to her a little bit later. I want to thank Callie of the Pine Tree Quilters Guild for helping to circulate information about this event. Laurie and I would both like to express our gratitude to Joanna Toro, Mandy Brown, and Kate Weber of the museum's education department for all of the time and thought they've put into tonight's presentation and for their assistance tonight. Kate will be helping off camera should any technical issues arise, which we're going to assume they won't. But thank you, Kate. And to tell you ahead about the format for this 1 hour program, Laurie has divided her presentation into 2 sections. Interspersed with those, I'm going to pose a few questions to her, and we're going to share a couple of short videos that we think you'll enjoy. We're going to leave approximately 10 minutes at the end to collect the questions from you. Now, it has been our kind of confident assumption that a large number of the people attending this program are themselves quilters. And so we thought we would issue a very quick little poll to see if that is correct. So respond when you see a little poll on your screen. Presumably you fit into one of these categories. Just click on it and submit. The results are coming up momentarily. Is it showing yet? I'm not seeing it on my screen, but it looks like, there we go. Wow. Yes, as we suspected. So I'm sure your questions for Laurie will reflect that insider curiosity. Now, some of you know that this book, which was published by, co-published by the Maine State Museum and Down East Books, is intended as a companion to a major exhibition at the museum that Laurie has curated. Unfortunately, that exhibition has been postponed for a couple of years because of critical work to repair and replace mechanical systems in the building. But this event and the enthusiasm around it gives us a hint of how much excitement there will be when the quilt exhibit does open, along with other exciting new elements at the museum. So please consider this your first invitation to join us for that celebration before too long. And now to the woman of the hour. Author Laurie LaBar is Chief Curator of History and Decorative Arts at the Maine State Museum. She began her career as an archaeologist focusing on early textile and pottery technology, and she received her master's degree in early American culture at Winterthur and the University of Delaware, with a specialty in Wabanaki trade silver. One of Laurie's previous books, Uncommon Threads, Wabanaki Textiles, Clothing, and Costumes, which she co-authored with her former colleague at the museum, Bruce Bork, won a prize from the Textile Society of America. And we're certain that this book will receive similar attention and accolades. We won't hear your applause, but please join me in welcoming Laurie LaBar. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you. And there are a lot of people to thank, and there's not enough hours in the day to thank all the people that helped with this project. If you have the book, you know there's about 4 pages of acknowledgments in little tiny type. So all I can say is thank you so much to my friends at the museum and to the Kobe and Foundation and Viles Foundation and the Pine Tree Quilters. Lynn Bassett and Pam Weeks and Deb Grana all wrote essays or parts of essays for the book. And I couldn't have asked for better volunteers and better colleagues. And all I can say is quilters, the Maine Quilt Study Group and the American Quilt Study Group, what a fantastic community of artisans and scholars that really did provide me comfort as well as community for this project. So as I bring up the pictures, there's you'll see that there are numbers by the quilts, and if it's just a number, that means it's in the Maine State Museum collection. Otherwise, there'll be some sort of identification as to where that the quilt is. So if you have a specific question about a specific quilt, I probably won't be able to answer it in the moment. Just send me an email and I'll be sure to get it back to you. In terms of the organization of the book, if you already have it, you already know, but I wanted to show how quilts could inform what we know about the past, and by so doing, bring women back into the discussion of our shared history. In my early drafts, I called it Quilt Speak, letting quilts tell their stories. But the book is roughly in chronological order for those of you who haven't seen it yet. And I talk a lot about, as much as I can, about the people who made the quilts. And another thing that I talk about is what was going on in Maine when they were making the quilts, and how is that reflected in their choices of design and in fabric, and how are current events shaping these quilts, and how are the current events reflected in these quilts. So with that, I will ask Kate to bring up the slideshow. And I don't think I'll have access to pointers, so I'll try and remember how to get, upper left, and I'll try not to get to my left and right mixed up. So I'm going to begin with the oldest quilt, because everybody asked, what's your oldest quilt? Well, this is the oldest quilt in the Maine State Museum collection. The fabrics were made in between 1750 and about 1780 or so. And so it was made sometime after that. And as you see, that the slide is not upside down. Those eagles do look like they're upside down, but you can see a label. And if you look down at the image of the quilt at the lower left, there is a little white label at the bottom, and that's how it's set up. So we know that the quilt was designed by this family and used by this family with the idea that whoever was lying in bed would see the images straight up. So this has block printing and copper plate engraved printing, and I'll get to that in another minute. Slide, please, Kate. And so as we're starting with the earliest quilts in the collection, one thing to note is that as late as 1790, over 90% of Euro-American settlers in Maine were British or of British descent. So over 90% as late as 1790. And the quilts that we see that are as early as that and even into the early 1800s definitely reflect that. Upper right is a medallion quilt dated 1804, and that is definitely a British design. And then the quilt on the upper left, the red one, I have that very small because it's a whole cloth quilt, and it isn't until you really pay attention to the quilting that this quilt pops. And as you can see, the quilting is very complex. It's a tree of life coming out of a heart at the bottom, and these are motifs that had been used for over 150 years in Britain, and it's a very British style of quilting. Next, please. And after, it doesn't take very long until the end of the we know what was going on in the 1700s, right? Late 1700s, the American Revolution, but there were other revolutions as well. And one of them, of course, was the Industrial Revolution. And within that, there was a revolution in textile technology in terms of its printing. So the one that we just saw had block printing. It had something called copper plate engraved printing. And copper plate printing is when you take a sheet of copper and you use metal gravers to carve into them, just as you would if you were making a trophy or if you were making a broadside to print. And instead of using the ink of the broadside, you use dyes. And some bright light figure. So that was invented in the 1750s, and became popular shortly after and was popular until around 1800 when something new took over. And that is on the picture, the blow up on the right, you can see those bright blues and yellows fabrics. Some bright lights said, you know, we like copper plate engraving, but it only shows you one color and it takes a long time to set up. So what if we took that copper plate and we made it into a cylinder and you could just roll the design over and over and over and over and over and you didn't have to pick it up and move it every time. So that, of course, is what became the norm around 1800. And all three processes, the copper plate engraving and the cylinder printing, existed alongside of block printing for quite some time. In fact, block printing is still done, especially in places like India. That is still a very important way of printing. Next, please. And there's one quilt that's in the Wilson Museum that incorporates all three kinds of printing. It's just fabulous. So the zigzaggy triangles, those are block printing, wood block printing. And then in the lower right, there's a cylinder print. And in the lower left is, again, that nice monochromatic copper plate engraving. Next, please. One of the things, so what was going on, this is what was going on at the time of all this, the late 1700s, early 1800s, with the Wabanaki community, because they were here and they were doing the most stunning, exacting, just mind-bending applique that I have ever seen. And it's made with silk ribbons, which they then sliced so that they were narrower. And some of these lines in the lower center, those are legging panels. And some of those lines are less than 1/8 of an inch wide. And of course, they're hemmed on each, they're not hemmed, but stitched down with an applique stitch on either side. And then those little peaks that you see are also little bits of silk that have been carefully appliqued. And none of those pieces of silk is larger than 1/2 inch high. They are minuscule and extremely exact. I've never seen anything like it. And it certainly surpasses anything that Euro-Americans were doing in Maine at the time. And we're very, very lucky to have a piece in our collection for which we know the name of the owner and the maker. And that's the cap on the upper right. That's a woman's cap. And in the lower right, you see a picture of Molly Molasses wearing her cap that is pictured there. And her baptismal name was Marie Pelagie, and she became known as Molly Molasses. And she lived in the Bangor area. She was Penobscot. And where I showed you the legging panels on the lower left, that's Francis Stanislaus. And he is wearing a band. He's wearing, they're not identical, but they had to be made by the same person. They are almost identical as a belt instead of out on his leggings. And these were made on panels so that when a new generation came along, they could swap them to a new coat. Or if somebody, you know how it is, people get broader as time goes on, you can put it on a new coat. And then in the upper left is swaddling clothes. So this is so just like Euro-Americans did, Wabanaki mothers swaddled their babies and they put them in cradle boards, and these are called cradle board wrappers, but think of them as swaddling clothes. And in the painting, this woman's name is Denise Sakabason. She's Passamaquoddy. She was the daughter of the chief, and she came to visit the English garrison in 1817 in Eastport during the War of 1812, when the British had taken over eastern Maine. And there you can see at her feet, she has a little, what looks like it might be a doll, but really this is folk art. It wasn't a doll. She was old. She had a baby at the time, and that was her baby. So this is what's going on in a different community. And I could talk for hours about that. So I better go to the next slide or we'll be here till morning. Thank you. So one of the things about this revolution, sorry, in textile technology is that because there's more mass production and there's these brand new colors and things, and the new way to print, textiles come down in cost. At the same time, you're getting more variety, and women definitely respond to that with textiles that are more varied and patterns that have a lot more action in them. And the upper left is actually a wool quilt, which is following the same kind of patterns of having more action and a lot more color. The 1830s, I think of them sort of like as the 1970s in terms of their color choices. They are boingy. And the browns in that wool quilt were once almost black. So it was in black and orange and green and turquoise. Next, please. Okay, could you show, thank you. So around 1840, there's a new fad kind of sweeps the country, which is making album quilts in which each person makes their own square. Sometimes one woman made an album quilt, but usually it was a community that made a quilt. And it might just be a group of friends, it might be a group of family members, it might be a temperance organization trying to raise some money, that type of a thing. And in the center of all this is the Mid-Atlantic, and the album quilts from Maryland, from Baltimore, album quilts were absolutely stunning. But it turns out those were the product of professional women who made the patterns, and then it was almost like they were kits, not quite, but kind of like. And whereas up here in Maine, it was definitely much more of amateur hour when it came to album quilts. So here are two examples. These are both from Cape Elizabeth, and it seems to me that the point was for everybody to do their own thing and then put them together with no rhyme or reason in terms of designing a layout, except that the newer one has a medallion in the center. So I'm going to show you a little bit. Those were made about 15 years apart, but both from the same neighborhood. Can I have the next slide, please? And I'll show you one of the reasons. This is one of the reasons that album quilts are so darn much fun, is you get these little pieces of absolutely exquisite folk art in them. And that brings up the idea of the inscribed names. So just because a name is on a quilt block doesn't mean that person made it. We have an 1850 block with two little girls in applique on, and those girls were 2 years old. They did not make that when that quilt was made. They did not make that quilt block. And in this case, this quilt block was also not made by the person whose name on it. George Lovett was a fisherman. This is probably his fishing boat. His wife also had a block on the quilt, so she may have made it, the quilt block. Next, please. And in the later one, this was an opportunity. This was a lot of Deb Grana's sleuthing. She found the quilt and she did a lot of the sleuthing on it. And so in addition to these wonderful folk art images, we had to figure out how old is this quilt, because there was nothing on it, and we could bring it down to like 20 years, but when? And so this is when you start to get sleuthing with the name. So I'm going to read, because this is a book launch, I'll read from the book. So Angela Emery married Richard Lee Jr. on March 3rd, 1854. Her married name appears on her quilt block. Valera Jane Smart married John Murch on August 28th, 1859. Her maiden name is on her quilt block. Together, these wedding dates imply that the quilt was made between the spring of 1854 and the fall of 1859. Quilts take time to make, however, and some blocks are finished earlier than others. Clues on another block might move the completion date later. That block is decorated with an image of the Portland Breakwater Lighthouse, which is what you see here. The half-mile-long breakwater was completed in 1837. Officials constructed a wooden lighthouse on it in 1855, which fits in our range, but. So William Lee Willard was of Cape, he was from Cape Elizabeth, he was from this neighborhood. His sister-in-law has a quilt square on this quilt. So William Lee Willard of Cape Elizabeth was the second keeper of the lighthouse. He served from June 1857 until his death in February 1860 of a tumor. He was 26 years old. His older brother, Benjamin F. Willard Jr., took over the care of the lighthouse until a new keeper could be found. In 1861, Benjamin and his wife, Hannah Ann Stanley Emery Willard, how's that for a name, had a baby whom they named after Benjamin's deceased brother. And on the door of this lighthouse are the initials W.L.W. So I'm not sure, that could bring the date to 1860. This could be a commemorative block for him, or it could have been added on later when he died. But that was one of the fun challenges of this piece, and one of the fun challenges of making, just trying to learn about quilts. Next, please. There's another quilt, which is also an album quilt, which is wins the Heartwarming Story Award, and that is the Colesworthy Quilt from Falmouth. And young Joseph Colesworthy was going off to find his fame and fortune in the big city. And so before he left, the church ladies made a quilt for him so that to wish him well on his way. And he went off to search for fame and fortune, and he went all the way to Portland, which is 8 miles away, but he still got a farewell quilt, which I thought was adorable. Next, please. And that brings us to the Civil War. And the Civil War, there were women, individual women who made quilts to talk about how the how firmly they felt that the union was important to them, like the one on the left, which was made by Octavia Lewis of Jay in 1864. Also in 1864, a group of women, a community of women, these were young women, they made this quilt, and this is made with potholder style, which I'll talk about later, where every block is done separately, so that when you, I'll just talk about it now, so that when you make every quilt block separately, and you stitch it, you bind it, you quilt it, everything all separately, and then you have this little pile of things that look like potholders, and then you whip stitch them together and you get a quilt. So Pam Weeks dubbed them potholder quilts not too long ago, and the name has stuck. So this was made by a group of women. They were, the organizers were in their early 20s, and they were alumni of a school, a women's school. And it was in Portland. It's called the Portland Home Institute, excuse me, the Portland Home Institute. This was alumni, students, and faculty of that. And oftentimes these quilts were sent off to the quilts that a group had made would be sent off to be used for wounded soldiers, to give them comfort. And that leads us very neatly to back to Amy when we talk about comfort.
Thank you, Laurie. I do want to get to that comfort question, but first I want to ask you a sort of origin story about this massive project of yours, or the chicken and egg, which is to ask what you or the museum had in mind first, this book project or the exhibit project, and how did that proceed?
Well, I had been trying to learn more when I took over the responsibility for the quilt collection. I needed to learn more about them because I didn't know that much about them. So I started going to quilt study groups every month and learned all I could, and with the goal of having an exhibit. And then as I learned more and more, people started coming up to me and saying, will you write a book? And so the idea for the exhibit came first, and then the book, but they kind of worked in tandem. I did research for both of them all along. And the idea, of course, was going to be that they would all happen at the same time. And oh, well, so much for that.
Surprises always arise. So you mentioned, and I'll just draw people's attention again to the beautiful subtitle of both the exhibit and the book, which is 250 Years of Comfort and Community. And I know that you did a lot of work with the education department trying to explore both themes, and the idea of comfort and what it might mean to the visitors who would be coming to see the exhibit in future. So tell me about that process a little bit and what we're about to see.
Well, it was really fun. We talked about wanting to explore, to bring visitors into the experience, and to talk about what comfort meant to them and what community meant to them. So Joanna and some of the rest of us all got together and made a little nest, almost this little room where we could interview people. And we asked children about the idea of comfort, and we asked quilters about the idea of community. And this was made possible by a grant from the Kobe Foundation. And while Kate's bringing up the video, I'll probably just blather on until the video comes up. So it was really fun to see all these kids and what makes them feel comfortable and why they like what they like.
It makes me like feel safe, like it's like really comfy and cozy because my great grand has a lot of different kind of blankets. Whenever I come, she always gives me some.
My comfort item is a thing I call Sleepy Snake. I got him when I was a little kid from some very close friends of ours.
Makes you comfy when you fall them asleep and they're fluffy. Like, look at the fur. You each have a heart charms. I cuddle with her all night. I can't really sleep without her. She can't really sleep without me. This is Brown Bear. He's a special gift from my brother. He makes me feel safe and he helps me like control my temper. And his name is Isabella. It makes me feel comfortable because it's really warm and soft. And I like it because it's the same name as mine.
It's just a smooth rock. I like to hold it in my hand and kind of like rub it if I'm feeling nervous or anxious, and it brings me some comfort in that way.
Like sometimes when I'm laying in bed, I always am really scared sometimes because it's like a new house, you gotta get used to it. So I always have my monkey to cuddle with me, and I'd always read her books.
I've had to mend him at least 3 times. This is my very special stuffed animal, Ewok. My dad had it since he was about 7 years old. I brought it because it's one of my favorite stuffed animals. It brings comfort to me, and when I sleep, whenever I get scared, I like to hug it.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. So we'll pick it up now where I was before, which was at the Civil War, and then what happens afterwards. So what happens afterwards is actually, I called it cottons galore because holy cow, were there cottons. So in the early 1800s, in the mid 1800s, really, there was a lot of buildup of new mills, especially in of course, Massachusetts, but also in southern Maine, where along all the rivers in southern Maine. And this was where the 2 Maines that we talk about really got cemented because there was so much more development along the lower river reaches. And as well, there was a lot of things happening in Europe in terms of new dye stuffs. And of course, there were sewing machines. So these things all happened together and really caused just basically an explosion of different quilts. This is the most museums, this is the time period that they start having 1860, 1875. We start having a lot of quilts from that time period. And one of the things that happens is you have a lot of prints. So the quilt on the upper right, that is what we call, these days we call it a postage stamp quilt. Those blocks are 1 inch square, and they're 2 triangles together. So there's itty bitty little triangles all over that quilt. And in the lower left, that's called a charm quilt. That's what we call it today. And every single one of those diamonds in that quilt is a separate piece of fabric, distinct from any other piece of fabric. So that's all those different prints that she used. Next slide, please. Kate, can you change the slide, please? And, oh, we went 2 of them. Please go back 1. Thank you. And another thing that happens is you get all kinds of new patterns. So one of the, I'll just talk about this one group at the top and up to the right. Those are all variations on a log cabin theme. And if you have a new sewing machine, this is a great pattern to work with because all the lines are straight, even though you kind of, some of them look like there might be curves in them. They're all straight lines. But there were all kinds of quilts that got made as people became more proficient with sewing machines. More and more things were done with a sewing machine. And one of the things that these all have in common is you notice they're all kind of busy. There's a lot going on in these quilts. Okay, next please. And around 1780 or so, little bit earlier, but by the 1780, it was hitting its stride, came the crazy quilts. And in part, I think they were kind of a reaction against those very controlled quilts that continued to be made, even as crazy quilts were made as well. And these were not made to be on a bed. These were made for display. And the one at the upper right is a very typical crazy quilt where it's all silks and maybe a few velvets, and every single seam, of course, is covered up over with embroidery. And I've seen as many as 17 different embroidery stitches just over the seams, plus all the extra embroidery stitches, because every scrap, as you can see, even though it's a small picture, you can kind of see that there's embroidery and embellishment all over, and painting all over the little silks and velvets of that quilt. Now, the one at the lower left, that's a later one. It's from the early 1900s. It is from Presque Isle up in northern Maine, and its background is all black velvet. And all those bright colors that you see are velvety flowers and leaves and scraps from making hats. So this woman either worked in a millinery or knew someone who did have a millinery shop. So those, it's absolutely an exquisite quilt. And the back of it is lemon yellow. It is just electric. And in the middle is a wool quilt that's a crazy quilt. These are not what you think of when you think about crazy quilts. You don't think about wool, but Maine, oddly enough, has a lot of wool crazy quilts. And there's tend not to be as much embroidery on them. The seams, yes, but not much more, because I think it was just harder to embroider through all the layers of wool. But that's a very Maine thing. Yes, next, please. And that brings us to the 20th century. And there's a couple things you'll notice on this. I'll start with the one on the bottom left, which has that bullseye of rectangles. And that was from around 1911. And all those are poultry ribbons. So this woman had a very strong ties to the Poultry Association of Maine. And this reflects her community involvement there. Another community quilt is the green one near the top. And that was made in 1996 by the Clamshell Quilters, a group of quilters that meet in the Damerscott area. And they made 12 small wall hangings to give to the governor's house, to the Blaine House. And so the museum cares for them, but they go on display from time to time at the Blaine House. And it's the 12 Days of Christmas, and this is instead of 4 calling birds, this is 4 chickadees. The other two in the upper left and lower right corners, you may notice that the colors scheme is very, very different from the last slide. There's not a lot of those bold reds and those dark browns. The color scheme is very different. And the reasons for that are both technological and political. So most of those wonderful dark reds and browns and everything, those were made by dye makers in Germany. And of course, in the early 1900s, we're at war with Germany. And Germany's dye industry is destroyed during the war, along with its economy. And so American dye makers come to the fore. And when they make these dyes, the colors that they're looking at something a little different, because they want these dyes to look good under that newfangled electric lighting. And so it's a whole different palette because of electricity and, of course, because of the war. Next, please. There's still more community. Community is important continually throughout the history of Maine quilts. The quilt on the left was made in Phippsburg, and the ladies of Phippsburg was made in 1935. And the ladies of Phippsburg had been making quilts as fundraisers, and they've been doing other fundraisers to buy things for the library or buy things for the fire department. And during the Depression, they realized that school kids were going to town from their town. School kids from their town were going to school without any shoes on. And they realized how people in their town were suffering, and they shifted from raising money for local institutions to raising money for local people. And this is one of the quilts that they made. And each block is a song. So we call it the Phippsburg Song Quilt. And to win this quilt, you paid money to guess what the songs were. And the one who guessed the right song, one who guessed the most songs got the quilt. And some of them are easy. There's the Three Crows, that's a song. The Sidewalks of New York, Bear Went Over the Mountain, but some of them are a lot more subtle. And I've spent a lot of time trying to psych out what some of these are. And they actually had a list that was in random order to help the locals kind of get an edge to get them. But But one thing that I found was interesting is this was made in 1935 and sold in 1936, but the songs were all popular 20 years earlier. They were all from the 19 teens. So it tells you something about the age of the women that were making the quilt, that they were looking back to their favorite songs were 20 years before in their youth. And then the quilt on the right is a bicentennial quilt. And this is from Augusta, a group of people from a retirement home in Augusta. And there's the usual things that celebrate the bicentennial. There's a bicentennial flag, there's the Liberty Bell, and then there's highlights of important buildings in Augusta, like the State House and the churches and the historic buildings. And my personal favorite, Mr. Market. Mr. Market grocery store made it onto this quilt, which I just think is delightful. And instead of embroidering on it, they used a fabric paint that came in a tube. And some of you quilters may remember this from your misspent youths. It would come in a tube and it had a ball point, and you could use it like a pen. And they used that. My family used them. I remember coloring with them. They were called Artex, was the brand we used. So you'll see on this slide, I sort of made the quilts go off to either side so that there was a big gap in the middle. And that's so that I would remember to mention that sort of 40 years between these quilts was a time when there weren't a lot of American quilts, relatively speaking. People were still making quilts that were utility quilts that you could give, to the baby or put on the bed and would get used up, but they weren't as popular as they had been. And then they became kind of passé after the World War II. But the bicentennial changed that, and they became popular again. Next slide, please. And they became popular, and they're still popular. That popularity they gained has just sort of snowballed. And so Maine Quilts today, I have to make an apology to quilters, contemporary quilters, because there is absolutely no way that I can represent the incredible richness of Maine's quilts today. There are so many gifted artists out there making truly spectacular quilts. And all I can do is I only have one slide for you here and just one chapter in the book, and they really are spectacular. But one thing I noticed is that there's three major threads, as it were, that connect today's quilts to those of the past. And there are those that just want something warm on the bed, and they want the comfort, and they want the comfort of a traditional pattern. So that's the type of quilt that they're attracted to, something like this traditional pattern could put on the bed. And there's others that then take those traditional patterns and they riff on them and make something that's really contemporary and new. So the upper left here, where it says Reed, Wendy Reed made that. She's using this is all hand embroidered, hand applique on the quilt, and it's hand stitched, hand quilted. And yet this is a piece that, even though it's using old techniques and old motifs, she is made something that is truly modern. And that brings us to the third pattern, which is some people see quilts as a form of artistic expression first and a quilt second. And Wendy straddles that. Some of hers are artistic expressions first, and some of hers are quilts first. On the lower right, Duncan and Gail Frass and Slade, they were making art quilts before the term art quilt got invented. In fact, their work was at the exhibit that invented that, where that first term was first used. And one of the things I love about this quilt is not only is it obviously an art quilt, it's very modern looking, but it's also using a traditional format in that this is a whole cloth quilt. And they have used dyes to paint the design on, and then they've quilted it. So I love the fact that it's very, very modern, and yet there's this thread that goes back to 200 years of quilting. Sarah Ann Smith, the green quilt at the top, sometimes she uses traditional techniques of applique, sometimes she uses more modern techniques and to make her own designs of quilts. And this one is a charming one that is called Descended from the Stars. And there's a labyrinth, which is the Chartres labyrinth, and then the seasons around it, and then a quote that talks about how we are descended from the stars. The bottom quilt is by Jude Spax. And there are several people who are using fabric collage and doing these very exquisite quilts that are very complex. Susan Carlson is one of the people that comes to mind. And Jude uses some people sew the pieces down. Some people fuse them down with a polyester that will join the two fabrics together. And some people, like Jude, do a combination of things. She sews some, she fuses some, she glues some, and her pieces are, she also paints. So some of her portraits will have a painted, they'll have cloth eyes, but they'll have a painted features, and then they'll have the fabric in the background as well. And one of her eyes can use up to 24 pieces of fabric in an eye that's only 1.5 to 2 inches wide. I mean, these things are incredibly complex and have a lot of depth, and they're very exciting. So the next slide, please. So having gone a whirlwind tour through the chronology of Maine Quilts, let me give you an exhibit preview. And these are all in the exhibit, in the book, I've put these different sections in their sort of thematic or temporal chronological chapters. But at the exhibit, I'm going to want to focus on community as when you first come in. And because you have to have 2 different halves of an exhibit, because there's textiles are so fragile, so things are only going to be up for 6 months. So we've already looked at the Wabanaki pieces, and 2 of those will be on in the first half of the exhibit, and 2 pieces will be on in the second half of the exhibit. And then the first half of the exhibit, the upper left, those are 3 quilts from what we're now up to 12 quilts. We have found 12 quilts from this one group of quilters from Cumberland that made quilts, but for about 10 years, from about 1844 or 1849. Hard to tell, that's hard to read that, up until about 1855. And it's fun taking a look at these. We really are able to find out things about the Cumberland community that you will not find in history books. And it is so wonderful. And I'm going to leave the spoiler alert there for that you look it up in the book. It's very exciting. And then the second half of the exhibit, there will be 2 different community things. There's 3 quilts, but they're telling 2 stories. The bottom center quilt, the brown one, is from North Haven Island, made around 1825. And I talk about in the exhibit and in the book, I talk about how it reflects the community of North Haven and life on North Haven, but also show how it connects back, how the relationship between life on the island and life on the mainland. And then the final one is 2 crazy quilts, and those are from Bailey Island, and there's a mystery there. And I won't, again, no spoilers, but that's a Bailey Island mystery, and I will give you a spoiler. I'm still working on it. So thank you very much. Is there oh yes, there's one more slide. And that is, I wanted to show you a community quilt from a contemporary community quilt. So the woman that made this quilt had been ill. She'd been very ill. And as she recovered, as part of her therapy, she was an avid quilter before she got sick. And she decided to try and get back into quilting by doing 1 block a day. And these are 5-inch, they start out 5 inches, they end up about 4.5 inches. She did 1 every day. And then there's 2 detail shots on the right. And on the top right, you can see how she cut the fabric away after she sewed it on to kind of reduce the bulk. And in that 1/4 of an inch of a seam allowance, she wrote on each square what she was doing that day. So on the lower detail, 2nd row down in the middle, you can see that there's a woman and she has a yellow halo. Well, that's the Virgin Mary. And so on the back of it, you see that she wrote that her friend Mary came to visit. So when she got to write it, to do the quilt block for the day, she's like, well, what happened today? Oh, Mary came to visit. Oh, I have Christmas fabric. I'll put a block of Mary in the Christmas fabric. And then the next one over is blue with stars. At the time, she was reading a book that was talking about blue, had the title included the word stars in the sky. And then when you finally get to see this quilt in the flesh, as it were, you'll be able to check it out at 2 different times. You'll be able to tell when she had an infestation of ants in her house, because there's picnic ants on the fabric. I don't know where she got that fabric, but it's really lovely. And this is about her life for 1 year, exactly 1 year. And it's also about a year in her community. And so that's going to be a very important quilt, American quilt, as time goes by. And with that discussion of community, I will turn it back to Amy.
Laurie, it's also tantalizing seeing this handful of them, and also, unfortunately, at modest size, when we'd all like to see them at their full scale. You started by telling us that one of your intentions with the exhibit in the book was to integrate women's history into Maine history. And it's not surprising as we glance through our participants and our registrants that we saw only a handful of men signing up and hundreds of women. So I'm sure that sort of reflects the gender split percentage in the quilting community, but I often wondered why. We know certain economic reasons that would have made this a domestic practice initially, but why shouldn't men get pleasure out of it too? Do you suppose that's a possibility, or would we want it to be?
Well, absolutely. And there are men who are phenomenal quilters out there. And but over time, because sewing was women's work, it tended to be women. And then around the time of the Boer War, the late 1800s in Great Britain, they started using sewing, quilting for men who were wounded in the war, and then World War I they did it again, because as a way to kind of occupational therapy, as a way to get these guys back to work them through their PTSD, what we would call today PTSD, what they called shell shock back in the day. And so there were men that did a lot of quilts then, but there also were some men that quilted in the late 1800s. And I don't know if you remember, there was a quilt that I showed in the Quilts Galore section where the quilt blocks were 1 inch square. Well, at that time period, it's like men took that as a challenge. I can do that. I can do one with more little tiny pieces. And so men got into this competitive thing nationwide, but they tended to be these quilts that were itty bitty little pieces. And then we have one in our collection, but it's not as pretty as the one that I showed in the book. It has some damage to it, so it wasn't as showable. But we have one that was made by a man. He didn't make it for a competition, but he saw it as a challenge and he did it. And then there's one quilt that I did show you that is made by a partnership of a couple. And Duncan is a quilter and has been a quilter for many years. And I know a few other male quilters, but they are few and far between. And I think it's still sort of seen as women's work, but it's changing. It's changing. There's a few men.
Indeed. So we have been looking at this incredible detail, beautiful design and piecework and stitchery, and we've been talking about community. So we now wanted to share with you a glimpse of some others in Maine's quilting community with another short video.
So while Kate loads it, we decided to ask quilters about community. We know that they give comfort and to people, and so we wanted to bring that along and talk about community as well.
I had just recovered from surgery, and so these dear friends of mine, we consider ourselves the 7 sisters. They, unbeknownst to me, put together this quilt and gave it to me one day when they all came to the house. So it is a prized possession of mine.
The reason I made this quilt is for my great nephew's daughter who was just born. Her name is Laura. It's made of scraps. And I spend a lot of my time making quilts for donation because I only have so much room for quilts in my house. Been quilting for over 40 years, so you can imagine I have a few quilts that I've made.
It's made from vintage feed sacks, which are cotton bags that held feed and flour and sugar in the 1930s and 40s, and I have quite a collection of them, and children like them because they have lots of fun novelty fabrics. This one is hand and machine quilted.
Their particular program, we bring quilts to them, and the people who are there for end-of-life issues are comforted by the quilts, and then their families bring them home. It promotes a tremendous amount of healing because they can wrap themselves up in it and think about their loved ones and how much being with them at the end helped, and how the quilts just made them feel warm
This one is special to me because it's for one of my kids who came home 3 years ago from Ukraine, and we have kind of a complicated relationship. You know, it's not, when you bring a teenager home into your family, there's a lot of different dynamics, and so I thought, you know, there's so many times when I try to tell him things that there's maybe a lack of trust or understanding, but you know, I don't make these quilts and spend months on them for someone that I don't love dearly. So I labeled this quilt, the name of this quilt is Proof, with that quote, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And it's kind of just a tongue-in-cheek, but hopefully a visual reminder for him that you know, he saw me spend the time on this quilt and knew it was for him, and I hope that that will be special to him.
I call it 4th of July at the ballpark, and it's for a child. When I make a quilt, I think more in terms of who it's going to cover versus what it's going to cover. I come from a long line of quilters. My mother grew up in rural North Carolina, and they used what they had to make quilts, and there's a big part of that in me.
You get all sorts of inspiration. You get sort of knowledge on how to do different things that you've not ever tried before. And I think belonging to a quilting group is one of the best things you can do. But everybody always says that you should think outside the box. And my comment is, what box? Because I always like to do things a little bit different.
So Laurie, while that video is wrapping up, I'm going to actually respond to the most common questions posed in the chat before posing one to you. And everyone has been asking where the book might be available and whether this presentation will be made available. We have been recording it. We do expect that the museum will post it either on the their YouTube channel or the website or our social media. Will keep you posted. And as for the book, ordinarily the best place to purchase the book would be the museum store, but because the museum is currently closed, so is its shop. So we want to encourage you all to look first in your own communities, in your local bookstores, and patronize them or order from them. And secondarily, you will find it on Amazon. And I just, before sharing some of the interesting questions from the group, I'm just wondering, what are the questions most often posed to you, Laurie? Do you want to show us a few images of?
Sure. There's a couple of questions that people ask me at almost every quilt gathering. So I actually prepared 3 slides for that. So Kate, can you bring it back again, please? Thank you very much. So one of the questions that I get, of course, is what's your favorite quilt, which is a little bit like what's your favorite kid. And so this is one of my favorite quilts. I tend to have favorites for sort of, it's like flowers. I tend to have favorite flowers for every time of year. And this is one of my very favorites. And it's a wonderful quilt. It's from Alexander, Maine, which is way over by Calais. She bought the fabric, not in Calais, but in St. Stephen over the border, because that was the biggest town around. And it was made in 1868. And I look at this wild quilt. And so I made up a story for it, which I think also it is faded. So all of those yellow, grayish yellow done leaves, those were all green. Those were all bright green at one time. So the story that, next slide, please. So I've told myself a story that what happened was Peter Max, the artist from the 60s, and he's still alive actually, is that he got tired of all the hubbub in the 1960s and time traveled back to Maine in 1868, so 100 years back. And he met this woman, Anne Cotter Drain, and the two of them collaborated on a quilt that had the same types of motifs that he used in his art. And wouldn't that be fun if it were true? Then he got really busy. He decided he really missed the craziness of the 60s after all. And so he went back and became a world-renowned artist. But actually, no, we don't know that. We know that her daughter told her granddaughter, that her mother used the leaves of trees and plants around the house to make some of these leaves, and the stars, the sun and the stars, and there's birds. Those are just absolutely wonderful and inspirational. So that, I love that quilt for this reason. Next, please. And another question that people ask a lot of is, what makes a Maine quilt a Maine quilt? And this is a really good example. And I call this quilt research saves the day, because this quilt was said to be from South Bristol. And because we could only find 2 people's names, and they were fairly common names. And that was the best we could do. But when I was doing some research for it, I kept coming up blank, searching Bristol area for any of these people. And finally, I put in Trifonia Handlet, which was the name on the quilt. And good old, thank you, Ancestry. It said, well, we don't have any Trifonia Handlet, but we have a Trifonia Hoodlet. So on the right side, you'll see that Trifonia's block is degrading quite badly. And there you can see how hard it was to see her name on the bottom. And so Hoodlet is a very common name in the town I live in. And it turns out that this is from, in fact, the town I live in. It's from Dresden, Maine. And it was so much fun to get that resolved. And once I put in Dresden for a location, all of a sudden, all these names came in. And so that was really fun. But what makes this and I went to the cemetery to see some of them, to pay my respects, because it's just so much fun being able to tell, hey, we got your quilt figured out. But what makes this a Maine quilt? Well, a lot of Maine quilts have those cut corners, those 2 corners at the bottom that are cut out. A lot of Maine quilts had those, and they are, other places do too. But if anybody's ever read the book, Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn, it's sort of like that, where Maine is the epicenter for it. It occurs elsewhere as well. So that's what's happening here. And the cut corners were so that when you put it on the bed, it would go around the bedposts. And unlike other locations, Mainers continued apparently to use bedposts, and they continued to make quilts that had these cut corners. Another thing is potholder quilts. I mentioned them before, and this is a potholder quilt. I haven't mentioned that some of the other quilts were as well, and it's the same type of situation. You'll find them in Vermont, you'll find them in Massachusetts, you find them in Hampshire, just a few, and the epicenter for that tends to be here in Maine. And in fact, Wendy Reed, who we saw on the video and who made one of the contemporary quilts, she is behind a modern day resurgence and popularity of these quilts. And so I say good for her, because it's a lot easier to make a quilt that way. But one of the things that happens when you make them is that you get things a little wonky, because not everybody gets the memo. You say everything needs to be 11 inches, and somebody comes back and says, oh, I thought you said 11 and a half. It's inevitable. Anybody who's ever done quilting will tell you that. And so when their quilt block's already done, you get some hiccups that way. And so this one's a little uneven and wonky. And another thing that is a real Maine quilt trait, I sort of told you about the fact that it looks like everybody just pulled they tried to get the most diverse variety of blocks available. And you can definitely see that here. But another thing that's a very Maine quilt characteristic is blocks that are framed. So on this quilt, I think half the blocks almost have frames. So if you look in the very top row, the second from the left, there's a quilt block, and then it has a frame of squares and squares on point all the way around it. You go to the next block, it's a square and a square, and then there's a white border, and then there's a brown border, and then you go to the next one, and there's an 8-pointed star, and then there's a whole border of triangles around that, and the next one is almost all the ones on the top row have these extra frames around them, and that is a very Maine characteristic too. So while you can't just see one of these motifs or styles or whatever we want to call them, you can't, just one isn't going to clue you in. But when you've got 3 of them like this quilt, you can say almost certainly it's going to be from Maine. So those are my first 2 questions that I get, but I would love to hear questions from
yes. So we have reached our hour point, but we're going to keep going for just a few more minutes because there are some great questions here. So stick around. This will be like the lightning round, and I'll fire them at you quickly, Laurie.
And I'll answer them as fast as I can.
From early on, Mary had asked about the Wabanaki applique. She was curious, where did the Wabanaki get their silks and what type of needles did they use?
They got their silks, their needles, their woolens. They got those all in trade or as gifts. The state gave, first Massachusetts and then Maine was supposed to give a certain amount of wool to each tribe. It was called annuity cloth. And so that's where, so they got some of the wool, but a lot of it they traded for. And so these are all the silk ribbons that they would, the same types of silk ribbons that Euro-American women were using, but they were, getting them at a trading post or a store.
Great. Brenda wants to know how often you've come across layered quilts. She was surprised to repair once a 3-layered quilt. That was a family heirloom.
Yeah, one of my favorite quilts, which is not here because frankly, I wouldn't have let a dog use that quilt. This one quilt I'm thinking of, it was so ugly. But it was, somebody gave us all the quilts that were made in one family. And this quilt I think it probably had been used as a dog, but it had been cut down. It was strips. And we started poking away at it and we discovered that underneath those strips were more strips. And then underneath that was a whole cloth quilt that had once been absolutely spectacular. And there was a 4th quilt on top of that that had been cut off. And all you could see were these little bits of fabric, red fabric that were around the thighs. So that had a whole bunch of layers, but underneath it was a truly spectacular quilt. And then as it got older, it got passé, they covered it, it wound up in the servants' quarters and then wound up, kids were playing with it, they were cutting bits of it off. But so yeah, I see it occasionally, not really often, but every now and then.
Thank you. Nancy asked if the book or exhibit includes any quilts from the Shaker community.
I do not have any quilts from the Shaker community. We do not have any quilts from the Shaker community.
Jennifer, who had a few interesting questions and comments, and I think send you some hugs.
Second cousin Jennifer. Hi, she lives in Michigan.
Mentioned that she had recently learned about Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker, that he is an avid quilt collector.
He is.
And do you know much about his collection? Others responded a little bit in the chat.
Yeah, it's a stunning collection. It was at the International Quilt Study Center in Nebraska not too long ago. And if you Google that, you will find some wonderful videos and photographs of the exhibit. It is really a fantastic collection.
Makes sense somehow. And a last one, Linda was wondering if in your research you were able to draw on first-person accounts about the quilts, such as diaries or letters of the quilters.
Boy, there's not very many. Some quilts have notes on them, but they tend to be notes from like a grandchild's generation. And there's one quilt that's not in our collection, alas. It is at the Hamlin Library in South Paris, and there is a diary that references that quilt. It was also made with the Potholder Quilt, and a woman wrote in her diary that she doesn't approve of this way of making the quilt, but it worked well, and she wanted to make sure that she made a block because she deeply respected the minister's wife who was going to receive the quilt. So that's about the only one I know where someone's actually talking about a quilt and we can identify the quilt and the quilt block that she did.
Well, Laurie,
I see one more answer. One more question. I'm just from Kathleen that says, or from Laura, she says, how do you know if an antique quilt is worth saving for museum quality or worth using for another purpose? We have a great collection of quilts, and it really has to do with the mission of the museum. So our mission is to interpret the history of Maine and prehistory of Maine and natural history of Maine, but quilts don't fall under those categories. So it has to be a Maine quilt for us to take it on, or have been in Maine for a very, very long time, as some of them have been. And one of the things that makes a quilt valuable is not just condition, but its history. So if you don't know who made the quilt and you got it at a yard sale, chances are, unless it is absolutely spectacular, a museum is probably not going to be interested, in which case you have all kinds of things that you can do with it. I love quilts, and I have 6 quilts of my own that have no provenance, that I am the one behind us. This is somebody on the coast of Maine who was a collector had this, but we don't know if it's from Maine or not. because she died and then she didn't pass on her stories. So if any of you guys know about old quilts in the family and somebody a generation above you knows something about them, write it down, please. Put it on the back of the quilt, please. So that's my end of plea.
I'm going to wrap up as we started with just a little bit of business. I noticed that on this call, there are some friends of the museum, by which I mean in the formal sense, those who are members. And I hope that more of you will want to express your appreciation and loyalty to this great institution today and in the future. Mandy has put into the chat the museum's web address, and as well as a link to a special event that's coming up in July. This is a fundraiser called We'd Like to Propose a Toast. It will happen July 15th. It's a unique kind of fundraiser, another whirlwind cavalcade of Maine State history with toasts to great moments, presentations by staff, highlights from the collection, a silent auction, tickets that are very reasonably priced, and Maine humorist Gary Crocker is going to be our host. So that'll be fun. Follow the links, go to the website. Laurie, if we were in the same space, we'd be giving you flowers because your lunch and your book warrants that.
I'll be back at work on Monday. If you want to give me flowers Monday,
Okay.
I'll happily take them.
So thank you so much. Sincere congratulations. It's an incredible accomplishment. And thanks everybody for joining us.
And I'm sorry that I couldn't do this in person, but it's really a treat to know that people from a long distance away, and Jennifer, you're Michigan, that's the farthest one that I see here, but I know that Beth Barnard in Australia was also interested in attending. So you don't get the farthest away prize, I'm afraid, today, Jen. But thank you everybody for attending.
Couple from Canada.
Oh, Canada, wonderful.
Good night.
Night.